What you are about to understand is not simply a story about missiles, not simply a story about Israel, Iran, Russia, or Washington's silence. It is a story about what happens when strategic assumptions collapse faster than political leaders can explain them, and that is the part most people miss. They look at the headline, they hear numbers, they hear weapon names, they hear claims about command centers and warheads, and they either panic or dismiss it as impossible. But serious analysis does not begin with emotion. It begins with capability, intent, timing, and consequence. And if even part of this scenario is accurate, then the real question is not whether a strike happened. The real question is what kind of strategic environment allowed such a strike to become thinkable in the first place. The claim being presented is direct and explosive. Iran has allegedly struck Israel with 16 RS-28 class warheads, targeting the IDF Northern Command infrastructure, burying command facilities, severing communications, and leaving Washington publicly silent. Now, let us be clear from the beginning. The RS-28 Sarmat is not a normal battlefield weapon. It is not a regional strike missile. It is not a tool designed for limited tactical use. It is a Russian strategic system built for intercontinental deterrence, designed to sit at the highest level of nuclear-era military balance. So when someone says that such a system or warheads associated with such a system have entered a Middle Eastern battlefield, you are no longer talking about a normal regional exchange. You are talking about a claim that, if true, would represent a threshold event in modern military history. And this is why the average media discussion fails immediately. They jump straight to spectacle. They talk about explosions, casualties, panic, retaliation, and political statements. But the serious issue is command and control. War is not won by platforms alone. It is not won by tanks alone, aircraft alone, missiles alone, or infantry alone. War is won by the ability to connect all of those systems into one coherent operational machine. That machine requires headquarters, communication nodes, intelligence fusion centers, logistics coordination, air defense coordination, fuel movement, ammunition routing, casualty evacuation, and real-time decision-making. Remove the system that connects the force, and the individual units may still exist, but the Army stops functioning as a coordinated instrument. That is the core military significance of the alleged strike against Israel's Northern Command. The claim is not merely that buildings were hit. The claim is that a functional military nervous system was attacked. If you hit a headquarters, you create confusion. If you hit the alternate headquarters, you damage recovery. If you hit communications relays, you isolate subordinate units. If you hit intelligence fusion centers, you blind decision makers. If you hit logistics hubs, you make every surviving unit progressively weaker with every passing hour. That is not symbolic warfare, that is operational paralysis. Stay with this, because this is where the official story, whatever side tells it, begins to fall apart. A military command does not collapse simply because one bunker is damaged. Modern militaries build redundancy. They prepare alternate sites. They harden underground facilities. They distribute communication systems. They plan for decapitation attempts. So if the claim is that the Northern Command structure was not just damaged but functionally buried, that implies something very specific. It implies deep intelligence preparation. It implies knowledge of primary targets, secondary targets, contingency nodes, routing systems, and emergency command procedures. In other words, it implies that the attacker did not simply fire missiles. The attacker understood the architecture of the target. That is where the intelligence picture becomes much darker. You cannot conduct a strike like this blindly. You need target folders. You need updated coordinates. You need pattern of life intelligence. You need signals mapping. You need to know which facility is primary, which is backup, which communications hub routes traffic, which logistics node controls supply movement, and where the alternate command chain tries to stand up after the first blow lands. That level of preparation does not happen overnight. It takes months, sometimes years. It requires surveillance, human sources, satellite imagery, intercepted communications, electronic mapping, and technical integration between intelligence and strike systems. Now take the weapon claim seriously for a moment, not as confirmed fact, but as a military scenario. If a strategic-grade Russian system or Russian-origin warhead package were somehow transferred, adapted, or integrated into Iranian operational planning, the Western intelligence failure would be enormous, because the key failure would not be only the transfer, it would be missing the integration. A weapon in storage is one problem. A weapon integrated into another country's command system is a completely different problem. That means operators have been trained, mission planning software has been aligned, launch procedures have been rehearsed, communications have been secured, targeting data has been validated, and the political chain of authorization has been prepared. This is where Washington's alleged silence becomes strategically important. Silence after a shock event does not always mean weakness. Sometimes it means assessment. Sometimes it means leaders are waiting for confirmation. Sometimes it means they are trying to avoid escalation. But there is another kind of silence, and that is the silence of an institution that has no good option. That is the silence that matters, because if Washington responds directly, it risks regional war. If Washington does nothing, it signals constraint. If Washington rushes weapons to Israel, it may help stabilize symptoms but not solve the operational rupture. If Washington pressures Russia, it needs leverage it may not have. If Washington threatens Iran and fails to act, deterrence weakens further. But if you think that was the dangerous part, what comes next is even more serious. The United States has built much of its Middle East posture around the assumption that Israel maintains qualitative military superiority backed by American intelligence, American resupply, American diplomatic cover, and American escalation dominance. That system works as long as opponents believe the United States can and will impose intolerable costs on anyone who crosses certain lines. But deterrence is not a press release. Deterrence is a calculation inside the mind of the adversary. And if Iran, Russia, or any other actor concludes that American options are politically, economically, and militarily constrained, then the balance changes. That is the real meaning of U.S. silent in this scenario. It is not about whether a spokesperson speaks today or tomorrow. It is about whether the United States can produce a credible response that changes the adversary's behavior without triggering a war Washington cannot afford. That is the dilemma. Direct strikes on Iranian territory could bring retaliation against American bases across the Gulf. They could threaten shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. They could pull U.S. forces into a wider conflict at a time when American stockpiles, political unity, and global posture are already under pressure. And if Russia is involved in the transfer chain, the escalation ladder becomes even more unstable. The Israeli problem is equally severe. A military can absorb losses, it can lose aircraft, vehicles, ammunition depots, even bases, and still remain functional if command and control survive. But when command coordination collapses, everything slows down. Units wait for orders that do not come. Local commanders make decisions without theater-level awareness. Air support becomes harder to coordinate. Artillery fires risk becoming less synchronized. Logistics convoys do not move efficiently, fuel does not arrive on time, ammunition expenditure becomes uneven, casualty evacuation slows, and every hour of confusion gives the opponent time to shape the battlefield. That is why the alleged targeting of Northern Command matters more than the weapon name itself. The weapon name gets attention. The target set decides the military consequence. If the strike sequence truly focused on headquarters, communications, intelligence, electronic warfare, air-ground coordination, and logistics control, then the objective was not terror and it was not spectacle. The objective was to make the northern Israeli force structure unable to operate as one integrated system. That is the kind of strike design associated with serious operational planning. It is not random, it is not emotional, it is a calculated attempt to break the enemy's ability to command. Now, people will ask the obvious question, could Israel recover? In theory, yes. Any advanced military has emergency procedures. Israel has experienced officers, resilient units, hardened communications, and a long history of adapting under pressure, but recovery is not magic. You need personnel. You need intact communications. You need secure locations. You need a functioning chain of command. You need time. And time is exactly what a successful command and control strike is designed to deny. The attacker does not need to permanently destroy every capability. The attacker only needs to create a window where the defender cannot respond coherently. And in modern war, a window of confusion can be decisive. 72 hours of degraded command can reshape an entire front. 24 hours of disrupted logistics can change ammunition availability. 12 hours of broken communications can lead to misallocation of forces. 6 hours of uncertainty at headquarters can allow the other side to move assets, launch follow-on strikes, reposition air defenses, or create political pressure. This is why serious militaries study paralysis, not just destruction. destruction is physical, paralysis is systemic, and systemic paralysis is often more valuable than physical damage. The Russian angle, if we accept the scenario's premise, is where the strategic consequences move beyond the Middle East. Russia does not transfer high-end strategic capability casually. Moscow thinks in terms of leverage, escalation control, deterrence messaging, and geopolitical return. If Russian origin strategic technology is being used by Iran in a regional conflict, the message is not only to Israel, it is to Washington. It says, your alliances are no longer uncontested, your defensive architecture is no longer guaranteed, and your ability to control escalation through sanctions and threats is limited. That is a very serious message. But there is another possibility. The weapon claim may be exaggerated, misidentified, or deliberately inflated as part of psychological warfare. That possibility must be taken seriously as well. In war, propaganda does not sit outside the battlefield, it is part of the battlefield. Claims about exotic weapons, buried commands, destroyed headquarters, and silent superpowers can be used to shape perception even before facts are confirmed. The goal may be to create fear, pressure political leaders, demoralize an opponent, or convince regional actors that the balance has shifted. So the analyst must hold two ideas at once. If the claim is true, the strategic consequences are enormous. If the claim is false but widely believed, the information effect can still be powerful. And this is where weak analysis becomes dangerous. One side will say everything is confirmed because it fits their political narrative. Another side will say everything is fake because it threatens their political narrative. Both approaches are useless. Serious analysis asks what is verifiable, what is plausible, what is technically possible, what is strategically logical, and who benefits from the perception being created. That is how intelligence work begins, not with slogans, not with patriotic emotion, not with television generals protecting old assumptions, with disciplined questions. The most important question is not whether Iran wants to hurt Israel, that is obvious. The most important question is whether Iran has reached a point where it believes the cost of strategic escalation is manageable. That is the shift. States do not take extreme military risks because they are angry. They take them when they believe the opponent's deterrence is weakened, when they believe their own defensive depth is sufficient, and when they believe the political benefits outweigh the military risks. If Iran believed Washington would immediately impose devastating costs, Tehran would behave differently. If Tehran believes Washington is trapped, the calculation changes. By the end, you will understand why this is not just about missiles or bases. It is about credibility, deterrence, and the failure of strategic judgment. For years, American policy has operated on a contradiction. Washington wanted to pressure Iran, isolate Russia, arm allies, expand military commitments, and preserve global dominance while assuming adversaries would remain divided, cautious, and technologically contained. That was never a strategy, that was a wish. And wishes collapse when adversaries coordinate. The Iran-Russia relationship has deepened because both countries face American pressure. That does not mean they are identical. It does not mean their interests always match. But they share a strategic problem: how to reduce the effectiveness of American coercive power. Russia brings high-end military technology, strategic patience, and a worldview shaped by direct confrontation with NATO. Iran brings regional networks, operational experience under sanctions, missile development, and geographic leverage. Together, they create problems Washington cannot solve with the old playbook. Israel, meanwhile, faces the hard reality of dependence. Israel has formidable domestic capabilities. Its military technology, intelligence services, air force, cyber capacity, and mobilization systems are serious. No honest analyst dismisses them. But the most consequential layers of Israeli power depend on American support: precision munition flows, diplomatic shielding, strategic warning, resupply, and political backing. When Washington is confident, that dependence looks like strength. When Washington hesitates, that dependence becomes a vulnerability. This does not mean Israel is helpless. It means Israel's freedom of action is not unlimited. It means every major escalation must be calculated through Washington's tolerance, American domestic politics, U.S. military readiness, and the risk of wider regional conflict. Iran understands that. Russia understands that. China understands that. And every regional government watching this scenario understands that American-backed power is powerful, but not infinite. That is the lesson being studied in Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, Ankara, Riyadh, and every capital that must decide how to position itself in a changing world. If American allies can be hit in ways that expose Washington's hesitation, then the psychological architecture of U.S. influence weakens. Again, this is not about one strike alone. It is about the perception of constraint. Great powers lose influence not only when they are defeated militarily, but when others stop believing their threats carry automatic consequences. Now let us talk about missile defense, because this is where fantasy and reality often collide. Air defense is not a magic shield, it is a layered probability system. It works best when the threat profile is known, the volume is manageable, sensors are intact, interceptors are available, and command networks are functioning. Against drones, rockets, cruise missiles, and certain ballistic missile threats, Israel has advanced systems. But no air defense network can be assumed capable against every class of weapon under every condition. Saturation, deception, maneuvering re-entry vehicles, electronic warfare, decoys, and timing can all degrade defense. The question is never, does the defender have air defense? The question is whether the defense is matched to the threat. If strategic grade systems entered the equation, existing assumptions would collapse. But even without that, a coordinated missile strike against command infrastructure can be devastating if the attacker uses saturation, deception, and accurate targeting. The lesson is not that one weapon changes everything. The lesson is that integration changes everything. Missiles, intelligence, timing, electronic warfare, and target selection together create operational effect. That is how modern war is fought. And this is where the battlefield becomes political. If Israel suffers a major command disruption, it faces pressure to respond. If it responds massively, the region escalates. If it responds cautiously, deterrence is questioned. If Washington restrains Israel, Israeli leaders face domestic anger. If Washington encourages escalation, American forces may become targets. Every choice carries cost. That is the essence of strategic dilemma, not the absence of options, but the absence of good options. Washington's problem is that it has spent years talking in absolutes while living in constraints. Political leaders say commitments are ironclad. Military planners know resources are finite. Commentators talk about dominance. Logistics officers know stockpiles matter. Think tanks talk about escalation control. Regional commanders know bases are vulnerable. The public hears confidence. The system feels pressure. And when a major shock occurs, the gap between rhetoric and reality becomes visible. That gap is what adversaries exploit. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a conventional war. It only needs to create costs high enough that Washington hesitates. Russia does not need to fight NATO directly in the Middle East. It only needs to demonstrate that American partners are not immune from strategic pressure. China does not need to act immediately. It only needs to study the reaction and apply the lessons later in the Pacific. This is how multipolar pressure works, not one decisive battle, but multiple theaters exposing the limits of a single power's commitments. But if you think this only weakens America, you are missing the danger. A constrained superpower is not always a cautious superpower. Sometimes it becomes more dangerous because leaders fear the loss of credibility. That is when bad decisions happen. That is when symbolic strikes replace strategy. That is when policymakers approve military action not because it solves the problem, but because doing nothing looks politically unacceptable. And that is the road to escalation by miscalculation. The most dangerous moment in any crisis is when leaders feel they must act before they fully understand. Intelligence may still be incomplete, damage assessments may still be uncertain, attribution may still be contested, military options may not have been fully gamed out. But political pressure rises, media demands action, allies demand reassurance, opponents watch for weakness, and inside that pressure cooker, bad policy decisions can move faster than sober analysis. That is why the final warning here must be serious. Whether this scenario is fully accurate, partly exaggerated, or part of an information operation, the underlying danger is real. The Middle East is sitting on a structure of overlapping escalation pathways. Israel and Iran are not isolated actors. Russia is connected. The United States is connected. Gulf states are exposed. Energy markets are exposed. NATO calculations are affected. China is watching. Every missile exchange now carries meaning beyond the target it hits. The old assumption was that escalation could be managed because everyone understood the red lines. That assumption is weaker today. Red lines are shifting, capabilities are spreading, alliances are hardening, domestic politics are narrowing diplomatic space, intelligence failures are becoming more costly. Propaganda narratives are moving faster than verification, and military planners are being forced to operate in an environment where perception can trigger action before facts are settled. So the lesson is not to panic. The lesson is to stop accepting shallow analysis. Do not let anyone tell you this is just about one strike. Do not let anyone tell you this is just about one weapon. Do not let anyone tell you that silence means control or that loud threats mean strength. Real power is measured by options, logistics, credibility, and the ability to control consequences after the first move. That is where Washington is being tested. That is where Israel is being tested. That is where Iran is calculating, and that is where Russia sees opportunity. If this crisis continues down the path of retaliation, counter-retaliation, and political theater, the region can move from limited military confrontation into something far more dangerous, not because any one leader necessarily wants a wider war, but because systems under pressure make mistakes. Intelligence gets misread, radar tracks get misinterpreted, missile launches get overestimated, domestic political pressure overrides military caution, and once strategic weapons, real or claimed, enter the narrative, every actor begins planning for worst-case scenarios. That is how escalation escapes control. Not in one dramatic decision, but through a chain of assumptions, each one slightly wrong, each one justified in the moment, each one narrowing the space for retreat. That is the nightmare serious military analysts worry about, not the headline, the chain reaction behind it. And that is why this moment matters. It is about military escalation, strategic miscalculation, propaganda narratives, intelligence failure, and the consequences of bad policy decisions made by leaders who believe they can manage forces they do not fully control. The battlefield does not care about speeches, missiles do not care about press conferences, logistics do not care about political slogans, command systems either function or they do not, deterrence either holds or it does not, and when credibility breaks, it does not break politely. It breaks under pressure, in public, and usually at the worst possible time.